This was a special episode with Dr. James Fadiman, the co-founder of the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which transformed into Sofia University, which I have been a proud member of this scholarly academic community for a long time. I've served in so many ways this community, Sofia University. It is where my heart is. This was the co-founder of what became what Sofia University is today. He was a part of the early founding of the field of transpersonal psychology. And so the beginning of this conversation, we're mostly speaking about the historic record of how he contributed to the founding of the institution of Sofia University now and of the field of transpersonal psychology as a whole. He's the author of several books, the latest publication being Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance, co-authored by my friend Jordan Gruber, also the author of the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Highly recommended for you psychonauts out there. I love these two books as well. My favorite is probably this anthology, The Proper Study of Man. Be All That You Are is another great one. I had the opportunity shortly after the recording of this conversation to party with James Fadiman, with his wife, Dorothy. I loved meeting her, and she's an accomplished director, and Jordan Gruber as well. So this conversation is so close to my heart. It's a full circle moment in my journey in the field of transpersonal psychology and having moved to California. The podcast has been amazing. Who would you like to see on the podcast next? We are moving humanity forward together. We do this together. So comment, like, share, subscribe, and enjoy this conversation as much as I did in having it.
You must stay at the center of that mountain. There are 7 billion people in the world. Not everyone's going to get this.
Great morning, great afternoon, great evening, wherever this conversation finds you. I am Travis Gray. This is Gray Transforms. Today we are blessed to be transforming with another great guest, Dr. James Fadiman. I first moved to the Bay Area in the fall of 2013 to begin my journey in transpersonal psychology at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology that was co-founded by Dr. James Fadiman. Jim, it's been so awesome being a part of this field. And I remember the first time that we met in person was in 2013 at the Science and Non-Duality Conference, at the SANS conference. I remember being just so green, and I had just done some research online about the founding of the university, of the institution, because I was about to attend there. And then it was serendipitous that I came across you at the SANS conference as well. That was here in San Jose. And it was my first conference. I was so new to everything. I was very nervous. I remember having this experience with a quantum physicist where I was staring her in the eyes, and that was very intimidating. I remember coming up to you and just letting you know that I was joining this university that is now Sofia University. They've gone through so many transformations, and I'm still with them today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. It's a beautiful day in the Bay Area. How are you feeling?
Well, I'm remembering that particular non-duality conference, and it was it's so much wider than transpersonal, and I would look for things that I thought, this is too far out, and then I'd go to those.
Yeah.
And I really did learn some amazing things and met wonderful people.
Yeah.
And the talk I gave there is actually, I think it's my most popular talk on YouTube, probably because it was to a open to the mind audience, but not professionalized down in any direction.
Such a great conference that they put together. I think that's an Italian couple that puts that together. Is that correct? Yeah.
Right. No, they've done an amazing job over the years.
Absolutely.
Having it happen and attracting all kinds of people. I mean, they genuinely are as eclectic as you can get.
Yeah, absolutely. I had my first out-of-body experience there with this quantum breath workshop that I was a part of. And then for about 15 minutes, I was trying to get back to my body as I went to the next talk that I went to. And that next talk was what I just mentioned, that I was doing this eye gazing exercise with a quantum physicist I had earlier in that same day. I had watched her talk on the split experiment, the double slit experiment,
Sure.
and that just seemed, I was 21 years old at the time. That just seemed so out of reach for me. And then I'm eye gazing with her. I was so intimidated, but what a wonderful conference.
Well, what a wonderful, I mean, I know how wonderful it is to suddenly just find wherever you were from that here was a whole community of people, and suddenly you weren't even far out.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you'd been used to being this kind of freak person in your other group.
yeah,
And here you are
absolutely.
at the bottom of a huge freak pile.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm originally from Omaha, Nebraska,
You
so
got it. That's not a big transpersonal town.
yeah, not big. So, can you fill us in? How did your career in psychology begin? I know in 1975 you're co-founding the Institute of Transpersonal
Right.
Psychology, but what was happening prior to that moment? What was going on?
Well, the, in 61, I arrived at Stanford to be a graduate student in psychology. Now, I had a different career choice. At that time, my draft board said, we can give you a free trip to a Middle East, to a Southeast Asian country, and we'll supply even your uniforms and your guns. And I thought, I'd already gotten to the point where the idea of killing people in general didn't feel right. And people I didn't know seemed really kind of to beyond the pale. And also, I was terrified. And then they said, by the way, graduate school is a deferment. And suddenly, graduate school sounded magnificent. And I'd been living in Paris for a year, so I wasn't exactly prepping for graduate school. But I got to graduate school, and there was an off campus group called the International Foundation for Advanced Study. And they took me in as their psychologist. Now, remember, I'd had like 3 or 4 weeks of graduate psychology, so they weren't picking and choosing. They're just taking. And after some time, they said, you've had some experiences with Ram Dass, with Dick Alpert. Would you like to just have a session with us? And I'd had sessions which were very collegial, kind of grouping and bonding and feeling that you would do anything for this other person. But it never went beyond Jim Fadiman having experiences. And here I was with a group of people, and I was expecting the same thing, that I was going to be with a bunch of new people, and I took what I was offered. And after a while, the room got a little bright. In fact, it was almost too bright to see, and it had one wall, which was a huge window looking out on a tree, and the tree got more and more alive and more light. And when they suggested, would you like to lie down and maybe have an eye shade, I was thrilled because it was just overwhelming. And between headphones and eye shades and 3 or 4 hours, when I sat up, I had a different worldview. And that different worldview was expressed in a lot of the work I've done in the world, but transpersonal psychology was the first receptacle that could hold it. So when we set up the school, Bob and I talked about it sometime later, and had we known anything about what it took to set up a school, we never would have done it. And Bob said at one point, he said, we started the school on $500. And then he pauses and he says, and I loaned it to them. Okay. So we began a school with no campus and no curriculum and no faculty. So we weren't carrying a lot of baggage, but we had students who came from all over the country, and their first assignment, because we did have a campus, but we lost it. Your first assignment was, here's the real estate ads from the local community. Go through them and see if you can see something that we might be able to rent. That was the first night of the school, and we lost a couple of students. And we ended up with a lovely place, which had a hot tub. This was that era, and enough parking that nobody noticed that we were running a school. And we said to the students, what do you want to learn? And that's how we built curriculum over both people's desires for content and for people.
And that original campus was in Menlo Park, correct?
It's in Woodside, actually, near Menlo
Okay.
Park.
Yeah.
And it was a house, and the woman had recently been divorced. So we had the downstairs and the hot tub. And it was not usual academically, and I think it is no longer usual, for students to hot tub together after classes.
Yeah.
But it did break down a certain amount of the kind of social structures, and people got a very serious education. And by the time we were at the level of giving theses and PhDs, we had thesis. We had a curriculum. We had a different campus. It was much larger and much more sensible. And the school then thrived, and it thrived because there was a need that conventional psychology simply wasn't taking in enough of human experience. And so if you say you're the study of the mind or of consciousness, you say, except there are these large areas which we don't want to talk about, such as spiritual experience. So it was clear that we were filling in a space in the science kind of continuum or the rainbow that was empty.
Yeah.
And our students realized that. And our students, to our kind of pleasure and amazement, not only did really fine dissertations and learned a lot, but they also got jobs based solely on having been a graduate of a transpersonal graduate school.
Yeah, it's always been helpful for me anytime I'm applying to places that are maybe more conventionally clinical in foundation. I'm still bringing this niche opportunity to that organization. An example of that was a Piece It Together organization. A lot of the practitioners at Piece It Together are coming from Santa Clara University. So there's still a religious aspect to it, a spiritual aspect to it, but a very conventional approach. And I was always bringing something very unique, very niche to those areas, and that's what I've told other students as well on a similar path. It's been really amazing to be in this very unique field, transpersonal psychology. This was finally a field that could hold all the things that maybe you're interested in and all that you were bringing to the table. What does transpersonal psychology mean to you?
Well, it's really the study of all aspects of consciousness. Now, if you just think of consciousness like we think of many things, kind of a bell curve, and there's normal, and there are classes about that. And then down here on the right, there's growing amounts of psychopathology. And psychology has a lot of experience looking at psychopathology. It is totally normal as an undergraduate to take abnormal psychology and so forth and so on. It's respectable to study consciousness in trouble. But if we look at the normal curve, it's got another side that has as much under the curve as this one does. And it turns out that's where all the interesting people go. That's where the artists are. That's where the geniuses are. That's where the paradigm breakers. That's where the outlaws, lots of the criminals, the smart ones. And so we were looking and saying, well, if we're going to talk about consciousness, why would we not look at the best that consciousness has ever produced instead of most of the time looking at the people that have fallen through the cracks or are cracked? And so we developed a curriculum in which a lot of the studying was the best that humanity had produced. And what did they produce? And what we found is they produced science, they produced literature, they produced philosophy, they produced art, and they produced the major religious traditions and the minor spiritual traditions, minor being less members, not less better. It was kind of sensible. If you're not coming from a bias, and there was a bias in psychology, the bias was that higher awareness somehow should be down on the down end also, should be defective, that saints are nutty people because obviously they don't have regular jobs and they don't save and they aren't planning to retire and they don't look for a new car. There's something in that notion, there's something not more effective, but defective. And we just didn't buy that because that isn't what the evidence said. We were limited to what was actually so, not what was theoretically popular. And psychology in general had a clear bias, and the clear bias was to be, and notice the term, a science, a social science. Social science means you don't measure much. Science means you measure pretty well. And if you looked at the campus, you saw who got the new buildings. Physical science. There was a new chemistry building, a new physics building, the computer science building. There was never a new psychology building. But they wanted to be like science because those were the cool kids. So psychology in the years since transpersonal was formed has gone even more, not into the negative side of consciousness, the defective side, but towards hard science being measurable. And I got it one year. I was talking to a bunch of Stanford PhDs and postgrads, and there was somebody nice at this group. And I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm doing my dissertation." "What are you doing it on?" the visual system of ferrets. That didn't sound like psychology. And I said something much nicer than that. And she said, no, it's everyone's totally accepted. And I thought that's where Stanford had turned to be as hard science as possible, and that the transpersonal had stayed pretty much with the definition of psychology, which is, and it had its limitation, but it's mainly human consciousness. We were very unaware of animal consciousness, certainly totally unaware of plant consciousness, and nobody wanted to touch the forms of consciousness that we're seeing in even single-celled animals. And there's also some work being done now on what viruses and bacteria know, and a lot of work being done on how plants, for so forth, communicate. Most of that still isn't into transpersonal. So it's kind of human consciousness. And once we kind of are safe, then we're probably looking more into what might be called consciousness, which does not necessarily fit into a one physiological kind of box or another. I mean, for instance, trees help each other. They not only that, they help other species of trees. That's
and they
where
can
study.
attack other trees. They found a tree recently that takes lightning. It gets struck about 5 times in its lifetime, a certain kind of tree. It'll take the lightning and push it off to other plants in the near area. So it'll even
Well,
attack other trees.
there's if lightning was striking and you could deflect it, I don't think it's malevolence that you might want to do that. But what you're saying is we're learning again about how does consciousness in a larger sense function. And transpersonal, I hope, is expanding to include certainly the animal kingdom. That's the kind of easy, because if you have a pet, you've already learned that there are other consciousness. Unless maybe you have a fish, I'm not sure. So I got into it both because it made sense to me, and Bob Frager. The way we tried to divide it up over the years so people could get it is Bob Frager is the founder of the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. I'm listed as the co-founder. So I'm the guy who helped Bob. And the difference was that Bob had not gotten tenure at UC Santa Cruz because he was too interesting. He was totally accepted in 2 separate departments, which in the academic game means that nobody supports you because they think you really like that other department more. Not thinking, wait a moment, this is someone who is sufficiently educated that he appeals to a larger group of students. So Bob actually needed a job, and I didn't, but I needed something meaningful, and we were very close friends. We had been working on a book, which lasted about 35 years on personality theory. So that's the background, which is it seemed like the right thing to do, and we didn't know any better how tough it was going to be. And then gradually, when you try and fit yourself into the system, we found that there were basically places that says we were redlined, using another term, in certain ways by the psychological establishment. We were always accepted by the state and the nation, whose criteria were, are you teaching in ways that we can understand? And I remember when we were being approved of by the state of California, which was very important, and what we had was this wonderful guy who, that's all he did. He went in and either approved or told to try it again. And he said, we look to see not what are you teaching, but how are you doing it? He said, if you had a class on the sitting habits of polar bears, and we saw that you were doing it seriously, we're approving of that. So we're not concerned with your content. We just want to see, are you doing a good enough job? And at the end of, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours, he was, as he said, I'm happily impressed. So we never had any problem dealing with people that didn't, again, have a particular bias.
Yeah, well, Jim, I love to hear the history and all of that background. It's so rich, all of that background and all of that interest, all of that desire to do something meaningful. Your relationship with Robert and how all of that had created this university that I am so deeply grateful for. I'm the longest running student at this institution. I've graduated from 3 different programs: the bachelor's completion program, the master's of counseling psychology, and the doctoral program. So I've really
You've really
invested.
done it.
I've really done it. I've really been here, and I do hope that transpersonal psychology will continue to expand to encompass many different kinds of consciousness, but that full scope of that bell curve, like you said, I really like how you're putting that.
Transpersonal has expanded not much in the United States. I recently was asked, would I kind of do an opening, hello, we're glad you're here, to the South American Transpersonal Conference. And over a 3-day period, had 90 presenters. This was all in Spanish.
That's awesome.
The European Transpersonal Association has, at one point, it had more representative countries than NATO. And what was nice is because we didn't really have an ideological bias as well as a kind of science bias, the countries went in very different directions. I believe the French were all university professors. The Italian was from a yoga center and so forth, so that the richness of transpersonal, and particularly in the European world where we had all these different groupings, has continued to kind of enrich, moving from defensive, which is where we started, to how else can we help, is a very nice interpsychological shift. So you're in a program that basically says you're here to learn a bunch of stuff, and we're not defensive about it.
Yep.
Because we teach that, and
Yep.
we've taught it for enough years, and we have enough faculty, we have enough, and we also can say to you, which is a realistic question, how am I ever going to get a job with this degree? And we say, number of our students are, I remember the first time we had a student whose job it was in the federal government to distribute money.
Yeah.
And kind of, in the academic game, that's way above full professor. Because you're really then helping to develop the field in an immediate way, not in a kind of talky way.
Yeah. Well, Jim, this is why I began this podcast, was that the field of transpersonal psychology, students of the field need representation of what it looks like to be a professional in this field. And when I first started this podcast, I had a long list of the avatar guests or the star guests that I would like to have, and you are on that list. So I'm so happy to have this conversation once again. Like you're saying, Eurotoss, I've represented Sofia University. In 2017 was the first Eurotoss conference that I attended. It was more of an international transpersonal combined with Eurotoss, and that was in Prague. And that was wonderful. My first time outside the country was all brought to my experience through this field. Just the other day, I was looking at Japan. Even Japan has a transpersonal psychology association. So,
absolutely. No, I remember
all over the world there are these associations, and it's
I'll
it's
tell
really
you
beautiful.
just a Japan story. They were starting up, and we had a couple of students from Japan, and they and someone else talked to me because they said, would you come to Japan and open our conference? And I said, no. I said, the reason is because it has to be the Japanese Transpersonal Association, not an interesting American. I've been to Japan and been an interesting American. I love it. And we talked about it, and they agreed that they had to find from within Japan if they wanted to be a Japanese transpersonal. And their first conference, they were blown away with how many presenters they were able to put together and how many people wanted to come.
Yeah, I've reached out to a philosopher that's in Japan. That he was a part of like the Kyoto University. I think he's the he ran one of the departments. He was somehow a key member there, and I've reached out to him. So hopefully I'll get some word back. I would love to visit Japan for transpersonal psychology. That'd be amazing. The next Eurotoss conference is happening in Mexico, so still in Spanish, predominantly South American, but happening in Oaxaca. So that's this October. I'm looking forward to that one as well. The last one that I went to was in Oxford. So my first time getting to introduce myself as Dr. Gray, as a PhD, was in Oxford University. And that was a wonderful Harry Potter moment for me. You've been really prolific, and I've loved the kinds of books that you have. I have a bunch of them on my shelf here. There is Be All That You Are. I really think that's the bell curve that you were speaking about in defining transpersonal psychology, is that you can have your trauma and dysfunction. You have your normalcy, normal consciousness, normal experience that can also be improved, also be optimized. And then you have this other edge where, that's the farthest reaches of human nature that Abraham Maslow was searching for, and we can encompass all that in this field. It's a
Oh,
beautiful
one of
thing.
the
So
things that's always been curious for me, and it didn't even make sense from what psychology said it was wanted to be, let alone it didn't want us, is why is it that what's called self-help is not in the middle of a psychology curriculum? There's huge numbers of books published that sell millions of copies. People find them life-changing, meaning they're effective, they're useful. And I have yet to find in a transpersonal or a regular curriculum basic self-help. So that book that you're pointing to, Be All That You Are, I met someone who developed a system using affirmations, positive statements predicting a favorable future. There's now a lot of research on it. There was none at the time, but he was basically helping people. As he said, he was a failure, so he wanted to start by helping failures. He found that failures were fairly committed to failure. Their affirmations were negative. So he ended up with moderately successful people who became very successful. And so I had the pleasure of working with that system for a number of years. And as I do, when I'm in the middle of something, I'll do a book about it. And that's where my exit, I think, starts, where there's now other uses. If we look at it, why wouldn't we be discussing as part of your curriculum how to use the tools that self-help has made popular? What's the research? What are the results? What's going on? Bob and I taught Bob this system, and he was a beautiful teacher of it. And for a couple of years during orientation, we would do a scaled down version of this course, rather intense, 2 days instead of the 4 days that it took. And again, students indicated two things. One, it was obviously useful tools. And two is they had no experience. Even though I've been at the center of transpersonal, I tend to be someone that likes to go to the farthest walls and push on them a little, which
absolutely.
is to make the room bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should be encouraged to do that as students of the field and
Yep.
as PhDs. That is what getting a PhD is about, pushing those edges. I've loved like the work of Jorge Freire as an example of that. He's really pushing the edges in a very unique ways, but to participate in how those edges are pushed, I think is super valuable. I like what you're saying about self-help as a cornerstone in therapeutic training programs.
Right, right.
I don't see why that wouldn't be the case. I don't know why that seems to be a missing element. I think some of the students in the field could benefit from being under the kind of tutelage that would help them be authors of those kinds of books. There's not really a authorship training program or entrepreneurial endeavors and things like this. Sophia University now has a Master's of Business Administration program that is it's mostly geared towards visa students, which is awesome. It makes it a very rich, diverse experience. And I teach in that program. If some of those elements of professionalship, your entrepreneurship, your ability to make waves in the field and in dominant society through maybe self help is kind of a avenue for that. I think we would really benefit as a field and as individuals and in our exploration, figuring out what we would do as a professional in this field.
Transpersonal is still, just as psychology kind of wishes it was hard science, transpersonal kind of wishes it was psychology. And I recall we at one point, I think we got it at some point, which was APA, American Psychological Association, gives you a kind of clinical kind of, okay, you can teach clinical and your people can say they're clinical psychologists and they can apply for jobs as clinical psychologists. And the school just turned itself upside down, turning courses so it looked like we were real hard-nosed, not all that interesting clinicians. And so we applied, and I looked at it over, and it looked like we had managed to reach a level of normalness. And they wrote back and they said, "We're not accepting you." And I thought, you certainly wasted a lot of money and time, because I think I know why they didn't accept us. Because the letter was like 6 pages, but there was one paragraph, and you just read it over, and you knew the lawyers had worked it over. because they weren't going to turn us down for what we taught on paper. They wanted to simply turn us down for what we taught. And so there was this little thing that, because it also said you can't you can't come back to us because we're not giving you anything that you did wrong. So you can't improve. And those of us, and we all have seen it in one way or another, who've dealt with prejudice, racial, social, religious, which form of psychotherapy you practice, all those, there's not much you can do at that point. And so what psychology was saying, and I looked at it and I thought, why are you not accepting us? Because that makes the whole field look less scientific. Or there's another term that Maslow used, scientistic, which is with a belief in science that is rigid and has limits, which is, for instance, and transpersonal has done the same thing. It's transpersonal. I'm guessing, do you have a parapsychology course?
No, I mean, I have not taken a
No, I mean the
parapsychology
curriculum.
course. I'm not sure. I haven't taken that myself.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the great parapsychologists of America, Charles Tart, was involved with the school for years, but we never had a course.
Mm.
Because if you go to a regular psychology program, they don't either.
Yeah.
Now, however, if you take 1,000 people and say, have you ever had, and then you list various parapsychological events, maybe 6 out of 10 will say yes.
Mhm.
Why isn't it in the curriculum?
Yeah.
So we all exist in a matrix of an institution.
Politics, a
Well,
matrix
an
of politics.
institution, by definition, wants to survive.
Mm.
That's its first. It's I don't want to change because that'll cost money and time, and it might not work.
Yeah.
There's a tendency for, and this is any institution, don't change, and watch out when you introduce new things into your system, because you will by definition have to disrupt the system to put something else in. A lot of physics, for example, didn't like quantum physics because quantum physics, and this is, I'm quoting now a professor of quantum physics, gentlemen, which also tells you how old this is, everything you know about physics you will find not to be true. That's pretty tough when you're a physicist. Where the wonderful thing about transpersonal is the students come in with none of those concerns. When you came in as a student, I mean, you went to that conference, and undoubtedly there was stuff there that you thought, I have the faintest idea what they're talking about. I mean, here's this, let's see, how to live with fairies. Now, wait a moment. In Omaha, we didn't have little fairies on, none of her. I never grew up with one. None of my friends. How could there be a whole school teaching how to better relate to the fairies in your garden?
Yeah. A whole workshop, a whole
The answer
talk.
is you go to that one and you probably you'll have some fascinating experiences that you won't have elsewhere.
Right. Yeah. At the Sands conference, it'll be a 45-minute talk, how to live with the fairies.
Right. Right.
But transpersonal psychology, it does end up in a gray area, the gray area of genius, or the gray area of, how does a person get to the highest rungs of their optimized performance in the
Right.
world. And then when you start trying to speak on metaphysical concepts of spirituality, they're hard to grasp. They're just intangibles that
But
don't want to
nobody
be
has.
accepted.
But things by definition may be hard to grasp. I
Yeah.
mean, here's a glass of water. I can hold the glass. Can I
Yeah.
hold the water?
Right.
No. But somehow it's okay
Yeah.
because we've all agreed that water is not graspable.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of bothers scientists when you say that.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
See, the problem is if it doesn't fit my system, I have two choices. One is get rid of it, and the other is change the system. Now, the system has its own kind of need to survive. And also, what do you do if your own training only allowed you a certain amount of freedom of thought? And it basically said, if you step outside this, you will not have a career. Let me give you an example since we're talking partly about me. I'm now at Stanford. I'm a graduate student. I'm doing psychedelics on the side because Stanford is terrified of becoming what's called the Harvard of the West. This was the Harvard of Leary and Alpert. And I want to do a dissertation on clinical analysis of 40 or 50 LSD therapy cases. And I find that getting the data is fine. I do a 3 to 5 hour interview with each person. I have like 400 questions. So I have like numbers and categories. If you don't read it, what it's in them, and also the categories were pretty normal. It took me close to a year to get a committee. I had 2 people and I needed a third. And the person who knew what I was doing was not a psychologist, so he couldn't be the chair of the committee. So I ended up with Jack Hilgard, PhD, chairman of the psychology department at Stanford, prior president of the American Psychological Association. And I was pretty well down to him because no one could attack him for taking me. And so I met with him, and he couldn't have been nicer and couldn't have been more supportive and kind and kind of avuncular and gentle and nice. And I said what I wanted to do and what I would like him to be the chairman. Again, you got to go back in history. He was wearing the jacket with the little leather patches to show that he'd had the jacket a long time. He had the pipe. That was considered cool. And I could see the smoke rings, go out over the desk. And he said, Mr. Fadiman, if you do this dissertation, you will never have a career in academic psychology. Now, I said, Dr. Hilgard, you took one risk with your career. And he'd taken a huge risk. He'd set up the first hypnosis laboratory in an academic setting and got attacked right and left because hypnosis didn't exist and all that data was very awkward since it didn't exist. And it didn't fit the psychology. It looked weird. And that was another smoke ring. And he said, all right, I'll be your chair. Now, what he said is, if you do this, you'll never have a degree in academic psychology. He meant it as a warning. I took it as a pleasure, which is, it said, you are free to do whatever it is that you can do, but academic psychology, which is the easy fallback, won't be accepting of you. And he was stunningly correct. Now, I ended up actually teaching in a couple of universities, including Stanford, but not in psychology.
Well, that's the rebellion of being a transpersonalist and being interested in the transformation of self and others is that you decide to take those risks in the unconventional path. And what an inspirational story for other students as well to hear that from you.
Well, and remember, but keep clear that I never had a very regular job for very long, and my teaching at Stanford was in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. No, I'd never had an engineering course, but I only taught graduate students, so it was safe. And I was part-time. I did teach at Brandeis, a regular school in a regular department. Maslow took a year off, and I was asked by him to take his place. But again, everyone else is gone, so I'm not kind of ratting anyone out. I wrote, Maslow and I talked. He said, I'd like you to take this place while I'm away for a year. I said, they won't accept me. He said, just write a letter to the chairman of the department and say what you'd like to teach. So I did. And I got a letter back that said, we'd be very happy to have you as a member of the department. Now, let's go backstage. At the faculty meeting, when it was discussed, nobody wanted me. Maslow said, it's my position. It's my year off. And he outranked everybody in terms of national importance. I want him to have this. So when I arrived, I was treated perfectly decently. But I learned later that they felt uncomfortable already, and they already had to deal with Maslow, which made them uncomfortable as well. So one has to have a certain amount, not of courage, but of understanding that the world will surprise you. And when you've built a graduate school with $500 loaned, you're aware that things can happen that don't make real sense and that aren't likely. And my getting Maslow's job is my first kind of really serious academic position, full-time position. That really doesn't fit the model, but it does fit the model of curious things happen if you're open for them.
Do you have defining moments with Abraham Maslow, Anthony Sudich, during a time of the creation of this field, transpersonal psychology?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm back from Brandeis. I have a wife, I have a child, I have a house. I don't have a job. But I then get a consulting job with a consulting group. Complicated story. Again, I filled in for someone. So I had clients, including Lockheed Space and Missiles. And you might think that's a very negative kind of company. That's entirely correct. They just did things for the Defense Department on what are called, by the way, at the time called cost plus contracts, which is no matter what we charge you, we can then just charge you more than that. And that's our profit. Now, do we pad this? Of course we do. I was actually now making enough money that I could support my family, and I was feeling that a certain amount of money just didn't feel very clean. And so Tony Sudich was putting together the transpersonal. And I said to Tony, I would like to volunteer a day a week to whatever you're doing. And Tony was very smart and said, that sounds like a good price. We can afford that. And I became part of the first team that created not transpersonal psychology, but the Transpersonal Institute and the journal and the association. And that was all really Tony. So I've been a helper. I helped Bob create the school, that was later, but earlier I helped Tony and a few others create Transpersonal itself. And Tony Sudich is the person who created Humanistic. So there's one human being who gets very little credit, who created 2 out of the 4 major psychologies when we think of psychology, which is quite amazing. And he did that not being able to walk, not being able to take care of himself. He had one arm that worked, and he had his facial muscles. He also didn't get paid for that. He earned a living as a psychotherapist.
Anthony Sudich is so inspirational. His story that does not get a lot of. I think that you did give a speech about Tony Sudich at the Asilomar conference that we
Yep.
did in 2019. That's such a beautiful experience that you were just able. You were just. I will offer one day of my time. I've done very similar things. I just always am offering my time for free, just to be with the community, just to do what I can and build up the professional experience and name in terms of the field, trying to be influential and impactful here. That is somehow maybe underappreciated or misunderstood, that early on in your career as a student, as a professional, there is a lot of free things that you're going to be giving your time for free
Absolutely.
often in trying to build yourself up and trying to be a credible person. Yeah, I'm sure Anthony Sudich was happy to be able to afford your time.
Well, the other part of it, as I say, I was really, in a sense, cleaning my own karmic clock because being paid by companies like Lockheed didn't feel like it felt like a very good use of my skills, but not the employer of choice.
Yeah.
And so one of the nice things is when you volunteer, you really have a lot of choice.
Yeah.
When you're trying to get work, you have very much fewer choices.
Mhm.
And you get to volunteer, as you have, in places you would like to spend time.
Absolutely. So now your career, a lot of books that have recently been published and have been on psychedelic studies, and
Yep.
you alluded a little bit to that some of your doctoral work at Stanford had to do with psychedelics. What got you into psychedelic studies initially, and then what led you to writing like a book like the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, and then our
Well,
most recent is
I wrote
Microdosing.
basically my psychedelic experience that I referred to early in the program. That kind of shifted my life. It basically said, "See all those walls? They're full of doors." So I keep opening doors, and as you know, when you go to places, things happen. I had no particular interest in writing about psychedelics because ineffable is a word one uses, and that's by definition you can't write about it. Mystical experience, I thought, had been very well covered by the world's great mystics. And then when I met Aldous Huxley at one point, I thought there's no point in my writing anything because there are great writers who are doing just fine. Um, but the world went on, and at some point, I'm seeing this is now 2008 or 9. It looked like we were not going to have a psychedelic renaissance, that the whole generation of which I was a part would basically vanish. And as there's an African saying, when an old man dies, a library is lost.
Mm.
So I thought, well, what do I have in my library? I have mostly things that other people have, but I thought, what do I know? What have I learned that isn't out there, that isn't available to someone? And so the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide was initially written. I thought, I'm just going to write down all the stuff that I know about, and I don't have to worry about finding a publisher because I won't, because the culture wasn't interested. And so I put together part of a manuscript, and someone mentioned inner traditions. And I thought, well, they won't take it, so I've got nothing to lose. And so I wrote them, and they said, send us a couple of chapters. So I did, and they wrote back, and they said, we'd like to publish your book. And I thought, are you guys really serious? And then I looked at the other things that Inner Traditions published, and I was very conservative for them. I mean, they have wonderful books on how to read the Akashic records, what the Pleiades have to tell us. They have a whole lot of amazing things that nobody else would publish, and they're very good at publishing. And I had a very good editor, and I basically made a book of all the things that I wanted people to be able to find. And the book has become, it kind of sells about the same amount every year, which is not usual for books. But it turned out that nobody had compiled some of the things that I knew about. Predominantly, the reason the book is of value to people is if you're going to be using higher dose psychedelics, the chances are you're not in a study. And again, no research and nobody trained. So you're probably going to want to do it right. And here's as well as we can do it for people who don't have training. It has a whole lot of things. And then, as you mentioned, it also was my chance to get some of my dissertation published. Because when I finished my dissertation, Hilgard was right, which is at the same time I finished my dissertation, Nixon passed the laws to prohibit anybody learning anything about psychedelics. So if I had submitted, as I could have, certain parts of it to journals, which would have been appropriate, and a year or two earlier, they would have probably published them. Nobody wanted to publish something that said what the president just made into law is that there isn't anything to learn, so we can't possibly publish something that says that is obvious nonsense. So that book came into being out of my feeling of I'd like to leave it behind as a kind of legacy. The more recent psychedelic book, Microdosing for Healing Health and Enhanced Performance, came out of 10 years of working with microdosing and realizing that, again, the model of psychedelic use is almost all mental. That if you look at the research studies, and there's lots of wonderful, good research studies about high doses, they're almost all about mental concern, mental illness, mental flexibility, creativity, depression. The closest they get to the physical is maybe anorexia. I was starting to compile reports from around the world, literally from over 50 countries, of people who are using microdosing, which included for many physical things. It turns out microdosing is very helpful for migraines. Psychotherapy, you don't think, not a great, if you have migraines, psychotherapy, not likely. That book is really a compilation of 10 years of making stacks of papers of people's reports. And then with the help of Jordan Gruber, who's worked with me on 2 books, we created a kind of compendium of what you need to know if you would like to improve your life without any of the exciting, interesting things that you've heard about psychedelics. Definition of microdose is it has nothing to do with everything you've heard about psychedelics. No visions, no God speaking to you directly, no anacondas eating you, all that. People feel better mentally, emotionally, and physically. And so that book is, again, to let people know that they don't have to have cluster headaches. They don't have to have treatment-resistant depression.
Well, I think books like this, what you have created, what you've been able to put out there. I know there are other books in psychedelics. I had a really great guest, Kyle Ortego, that wrote an amazing book on psychedelic and existential integration. And the books like Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, Microdosing, Your Legacy, you're a leading hero in this liberation of consciousness through this freedom to explore explore consciousness with psychedelic substances, to be a psychonaut, if you will. Now,
Sure.
it is important for everybody that is watching that this is should be done with integration as predominant. That your main purpose in your psychedelic exploration is how are you going to integrate this appropriately. I've noticed that that people are fetishizing the substance and sort of forgetting about their outlook, and their real intention initially was to seek some insight to bring into their everyday life. And so
Well,
what is the context that you believe is that distinguishes whether somebody should be taking a macro dose or a micro dose?
well, a high dose, macrodose, and by the way, the word macrodose never appeared until microdose. We
Yeah.
didn't need it.
Right.
It was just called a dose.
Yeah.
Um, is is a chance to really look into consciousness at a level you never thought possible. And intention, focus, set and setting, things that are necessary because it's a massive potential reorganization of your fundamental belief system. And therefore, you don't do it with a buddy in back of the gas station. That's what high doses are for. Microdoses have nothing to do with that. Microdoses do basically, instead of intention, probably just focus. Why would you want to do it? Well, you don't want to do it to get high because that's not, if you're high, it's not a microdose anymore. It's too high.
Right.
Well, I want to find out about it. Well, you won't have much experience. Nothing much is going to happen. Well, and I'm now giving you a real story. I'm a math student at a Ivy League university, and I'm really not doing very well. And I've told that microdosing might make it easier for me to do higher math. So I did. And I then decided to take the hardest math course in the undergraduate catalog. And I quote here, I sailed through it. He said, several of my math friends are now microdosing. Okay. Very different. Nothing spiritual, nothing elevated. Just how will it help this thing that I live in work better? And it turns out that we have to kind of change mindsets. High doses are still kind of seen as pharmaceuticals. That's because a lot of the research is, would you rather take an antidepressant, which hasn't worked, or would you rather take a high dose of psychedelics with integration and everything else? And that's the same group. Microdosing seems to improve the functioning of the whole organism. Now, we have a wonderful quote from Professor Nutt, N-U-T-T, fortunately for him, who was kind of the most important drug official in the British government. And at one point, he was asked to write an article about what are the things that are most dangerous and kill you. And he started it with tobacco and alcohol. And they fired him. Because those are kind of high income for the government and nobody wants to do anything about it. So he ended up, and way at the bottom of the list where there was like no deaths was LSD. So he was also looking at these substances seem to be pharmacologically the safest thing we've ever seen. So, and these have this incredibly life-changing possibilities. And when we were working on the book and I was in touch with him, he had a wonderful statement, which he said, if someone tells me here's something that's good for a whole lot of things, I am naturally skeptical. Meaning, am I being conned? And if you have been on Instagram for more than about 5 minutes, you've been conned. Okay. There's something that magically will cure something that nobody's ever cured. So here we were saying we got a lot of them. And so we liked his quote so much, we used it as the heading for a chapter because he was concerned about 5 or 10 things. And we had in that chapter like 35 different conditions from anorexia to A to Z, basically. And what we were looking at is how could that be? Because in the pharmacological model, it made no sense. Well, guess what's wrong? The model isn't the right one. Maslow, I believe, is one of the people that has this great saying is if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. So what if we said, well, is there anything that's good for everybody? And the answer is no, nothing's good for everybody. And then I would say, how about sleep? Oh, well, that's good for everything. How about eating better? Well, that's good for everything. Okay. How about relationships? Well, that's good for everything. So I said, well, let's look at the group of for everything. And it looks like from the data that I'm compiling all these years that microdosing looks more like those. And they said, but it's a molecule. And I said, well, how about vitamins? When you take vitamin A, you don't take vitamin A because you have a sciatic nerve. You take vitamin A because it makes the system work better. So here we are with something that makes the system work better. And at the right dose, it has almost no side effects that are measurable, let alone a problem. And it's not expensive. So that's why the microdosing book is like discovering that a lot of things you were worrying about, for which there are very expensive, difficult things available, that there may be an alternative way which basically says helps your body, which is this incredible healing thing, to work better.
Mhm.
So the math student had enough math so he could work with the higher math. If I looked at his book and had all kinds of microdoses, it would still look like a upper division math book. I wouldn't know what it was talking about. But he had enough so that he could develop his own skills. That's no different from the person who wrote us about improving his college volleyball. He said, I'm not really physically doing it better, but I now have a total grasp of the strategy. I can feel everyone on the team and how they're moving, and we're doing much better. So what are we doing with those two? One is a physiological awareness of other people. The other is an easier grasp of extraordinarily abstract systems. Well, what they have in common is if this is working better, you're going to do it better. So that's why. So they're both gifts of how something can be made useful, and they're both very, very low on theory, because there's a technical term for theory. It's a guess. See, guess is not classic. Theory is, that's called an educated guess. And what I love about certain fields, astronomy is my favorite. Astronomers love it when their theories are overturned. Other sciences get very uptight about it and sad. And I've spent 30 years developing this theory and it's not true.
Egos get hurt.
Right. But astronomers say, oh boy, we get to do a new theory. Because it turns out black holes aren't like this, they're like this and like this. So microdosing seems to be useful. And that's the only reason the book exists.
You wrote another book with Jordan
With
Gruber
Jordan.
called Symphony of Selves.
Right.
And I'm wondering, where do you think the microdosing integrates or affects that symphony of selves? What is
Symphony
your
of Selves, again, let's take a central assumption of almost unspoken in conventional psychology and in a lot of transpersonal, is you are a single unified self. Evidence? None. Okay? Theory? Elaborate. Okay? Down to there's only one divinity. It's also a kind of remarkable notion given all the experiences of humanity. Okay, well, I'll give you a quick test if you're a single unified self. Ready? Have you ever argued with yourself?
Yeah.
Who was the other person? Okay. Okay. Have you ever said, I don't know how I could have done that? Have you ever said, I'm going to regret this in the morning? Have you ever said, I don't need that second piece of cheesecake, but I'm going to have it anyway, and I know I shouldn't? Okay. So we have
I
internal
ate a
divisions.
donut yesterday that I regretted immediately.
Okay, and regretted it immediately. See, I would recommend that you should eat the donut and enjoy it and understand that part of you, which didn't get to eat the donut, is trying to, is kind of trying to shame you into so that you don't even keep your pleasure. Your goal is to have yourselves unified so that what you do fits and that you're helping each other like a community should. And that turns out to be a very healthy model.
Yeah.
So the Selves book says there's an overwhelming assumption that you're a single self. And as we say, there doesn't seem to be any evidence, but it's very, very powerful. So the Selves book is maybe literally 1,000 examples from physics, biology, psychology, theology, of all the people who said, that doesn't make sense. I know it's supposed to be true. And there's a kind of chisel, and there's a lot of systems that say, well, you're a divided self, there's little pieces of you, but there's really a higher self. And I was trying to figure out how do you know that? What's the evidence? And I thought, there's not much evidence. So then I now ask people when they say, well, this is what I'm really trying to do is be part of my higher self or my super self I say, what's your highest self's favorite restaurant? And there's this moment because their higher self doesn't have a restaurant, because their higher self doesn't have a personality. It's a set of ideas. So between suggesting that the single self is not, just has no evidence, and that the higher self doesn't have much evidence either, it's amazing how unpopular you can get in terms of people saying, well, I understand what you're saying, and it makes sense, and my ideas don't make sense, but I've had my ideas a long time. And what we're learning a very awful thing as a country. Many of us are saying, why is it that people support Trump when he lies about so many things? And the answer is that they have worked out a system in which they don't have to change their beliefs, regardless of what the data is. So when you write a book that questions a very fundamental belief, you're creating people that don't even want to open the book. I mean, I've got Selves down to that little, like 40 seconds that we spent with, do you talk to yourself?
Right.
Turns out, by the way, people who talk to themselves are mentally healthier. This is
Right.
statistics and regular psychology.
Right. So,
are healthier than people that don't.
well, Jim, isn't it, if I'm arguing with myself, isn't that because we're all crazy? And
No.
and then somebody that is getting the American Psychological Association, the kind of
Yeah.
pathological paradigm is that
Right.
if you're having multiple selves and
Right.
you're having a dysfunction and an
Right. No,
interruption,
there's
and
terms for it, disassociation and so forth.
right,
Freud
multiple
actually,
personality disorder.
well, Freud actually understood, because it was very common, that multiple selves is the way it is. William James was understanding.
Yeah.
Freud had a problem. The problem in Freud's life was not about theory, but his clients. Remember, he moved in a kind of wealthy Viennese subculture, and the clients were often children of his friends. So here, these children are talking about sexual abuse. Now, he's not going to do that to his friends, because he won't have any friends and he won't have any clients. So he says, what if all these things I'm hearing are fantasies? I keep my clients, I keep my friends, I keep my career. Now, I'm going to have to adjust some of my theories, and the healthy multiplicity goes away. It was well understood in American and European psychology because it makes sense. If you say, I devalue myself, all those I something myself, you're simply exhibiting normal mental functioning. Now, if you say, I'm a bad person and I'm going to have to stab my hand because it stole something, okay, then the selves have been sufficiently disassociated that they no longer identify with the being. That's a pathology, and that's what psychology is good at. And there's some fascinating books of healthy multiplicity and of not such healthy multiplicity. The Many Lives of Billy Milligan is written by a very fine author about a mental patient who had a lot of personalities. Some of them, for instance, spoke different languages. Two of them were artists. One did still lifes, and the other, I believe, only did landscapes. Very, very. And he's in a mental hospital because he did some bad things, or part of him did. If I kind of look at these books, they're all saying, let's start not with a theory. Let's start with observing what is called, in a technical term now, ready, real life evidence. And if the real life evidence looks like the theory was made up to deny or cover it, maybe that's not the theory I want. So I'm just now reading an amazingly long article in the New York Times Magazine, and it's taking ADHD, and it's saying ADHD has become popular is the wrong word, but it's now millions more people have it than did like 10 years ago.
Right.
And it's treated with speed, with stimulants,
Yep.
Adderall, etc. And here's a long article that says maybe it's not that. Now we've had it diagnosed like for 40 years. We have no biological marker that can show someone has it or not.
Right.
The only major therapy is called pharmaceutical, which changes physiological parameters. There's a disconnect there. Okay. It's going to be hard for the multi-billion-dollar companies that sell the medications to think that's a very interesting point. So I get attracted to things where real life evidence looks more compelling than convenient theory, or in some cases, just profiteering theories. And I'm not suggesting that the companies that sell these substances are arguing, because they've won the argument. And this article is going to cause a huge amount of upset in that part of the mental health world. At least I hope so. And what we're finding, for instance, that microdosing has this pretty much the same effect on a lot of people with diagnoses of ADHD as the pharmaceuticals, without the side effects, without the addiction, without the costs. And so that's kind of my new areas. If we can find a way that resolves certain real life problems easier, cheaper, safer, and faster, that's where that's my current interest.
Right. Can the microdosing affect the symphony of selves to be in more alignment with each
It's
other?
absolutely, your cells get more aligned when you're not denying them in the first place. That's the problem when you have the notion that you're a single self and the evidence is not there. I confess that isn't a problem of mine. And one of the nice things is when you have cells, if I do something well, another part of me can say, that was really good. It's not vanity, it's observation. And that's a fun part of understanding that you have cells. We just had a friend visit whose mental life is pretty messy. And we have two little dogs, and one little dog is very afraid of almost everybody. And my little dog was not afraid of her. And it was this incredible feeling for her to feel a kind of acceptance where there was obviously no theory involved. And it was not, as many dogs are, you exist, I love you. It was, you exist, I think you're a danger. And here's my little dog on her lap. And you began to see that she could see there was a part of herself that had already healed because she's busy healing from some really awful childhood stuff. In a funny way, I think people find that theory at some point just isn't nourishing. It's kind of like, I have a theory of gardening. Do you garden? Well, no. You're missing the best part. Mm-hmm. Well, I like theories, fine. That's fine. I like, I collected stamps at some point. Nothing wrong, nothing bad about that, but I didn't use the stamps for anything. Okay. They didn't expand my world except in a kind of intellectual sense. So the thing I like about transpersonal psychology, in a sense, if it gets accepted, it's going to be stuck at whatever level it's accepted. If it's seen as kind of dangerous, then it's encouraged to keep pushing in whatever edge looks important. And the nice part about, at one point when we were looking over the faculty, everyone had a spiritual practice. Nobody had the same spiritual practice. It was very confirming of what we were doing.
The combination of works, the Symphony of Selves, the Microdosing, the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, the other books that we've discussed, it's all a beautiful culmination of things that I am so deeply interested in. But I want to stick on the subject of microdosing real quick and psychedelics. So, do you believe that there's a difference in the effectiveness of pharmaceutically created psychedelic medicines and the naturally grown mushrooms from from the earth?
Well, see, the way you set it up is obviously things that have had 30 million years to work themselves out are better than something that's designed really to earn a profit. Okay, but that's theory. So fortunately, and it's a question that is an obvious one, which is the natural better than the synthetic? Fortunately, somebody and neither group had much interest in doing the research. The natural people couldn't care less, and the synthetic people didn't want to know because there were only two answers, and one of them didn't work for them. Well, somebody finally did some research, and as far as we can tell, in every measure, this is mostly high dose work. Um, Natural is superior for the same intentions. Now, what that says is the psychedelic renaissance for psilocybin has all been on using a slightly inferior version of psilocybin and its alkaloids in a mushroom. So it is likely that all of the effects for which there are now dozens of companies and a whole capitalist may be using slightly less valuable, inferior things. And there are now a couple of companies who are only using natural. So there is a difference. Theoretically, the way it is a molecule is a molecule is a molecule. And as Linus Pauling, who just got his Nobel Prize for vitamin C, was asked, how about oranges and how about synthetics? From his point of view is, if it's a vitamin C molecule, it's a vitamin C molecule. Now, he wasn't looking at what it was embedded in because he wasn't thinking of the natural world. But it turns out, as far as we know, nature's version is better.
Right. The orange has a better delivery system for that
Yeah,
vitamin C.
right. It's embedded in a delivery system, and the synthetic isn't.
That makes a lot of sense. When you're speaking about macro doses, rather, that it can be a significant restructuring of somebody's worldview. What do you think is the farthest reaches of where somebody can explore, what we can explore as far as psychedelic exploration goes? Is there kind of ceilings that people hit, or?
Fortunately, we have lots of people who feel they've gone as far as they can go, and they report having no physical identity, no psychological identity, no distinction of time, no awareness of limitations of space, and they're still there.
Right.
Okay, that's about as far as you can take it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
They then usually will say, the fundamental whatever it is that I am a part of and have been for eternity is more closely resembling love than any other word I can use.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael Pollan, even, who didn't quite go that far, comes up with that same realization that it feels like that, which makes the universe, from our point of view, at least positive, not neutral. That's what human experience has given us. And I, being a good transpersonal psychologist, I have a half dozen theoretical places I can stuff that, but the experience seems to be similar enough and found at the core of most of the major spiritual traditions, and in the words of both living and recordable saints, looks like it's fairly common.
Right. It is love. Love is the connecting factor
So
of all the things.
of or something that it isn't love as we understand it,
Mm-hmm.
but as I say, people say, if I had to use one word,
Mm-hmm.
unity, divinity, um, but when you and that also that people seem to say, I'm aware that I was neither born nor will I die. Okay, that's a whole nother set of experiences, and a whole lot of spiritual systems deal with what happens after death, not so many deal with what precedes death, precedes life.
Yeah, it's a love that's not based on a condition, but it's based on an isness. This
Well,
love.
at the moment, I'm looking at this light, my light bulb. Now, this light bulb is putting out light, but it's putting out a very specific kind of light. But also, it looks a lot like the light that the sun does, only the sun has kind of more of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I can say sunlight and lamplight, and I'm talking about subdivisions of the same larger reality.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about when people talk about their experiences. And the experience that it seems to be one, and then as one returns to one's self, one's body, one's physical time and space, this reincarnation, another way of saying it, there is often a kind of puzzlement of the feeling of incredible shrinkage. How can this, with only a few billion cells, comprehend that? And the answer is it can't. But it can recall something like what I've just described. Transpersonal is based on, if it's based on anything, it's based on the reality of that experience and the reality of what do you do with it. Jesus goes out in the desert and has an experience. Muhammad is visited by an archangel and says, I want you to write this down. And Muhammad says, I'm illiterate. And the angel says, write it down. The reality is, he remembers real well, and he goes and has a scribe write it down.
Right.
Okay. And again, we know whatever your tradition is, there are moments in which you are either more than yourself or yourself is put aside. And people talk about speaking with the word of God. And we know that's true. If you think of each of us as a hose, I have a garden, and when I turn on the water, the hose fills with water. And the hose may say to itself, I am really unbelievably special. Look at what I can do. And the water says, not only you didn't have almost nothing to do with it, but passing through you, I now taste a little bit of hose. I'm not pure water. And there's no way around that. So when someone says God has spoken to me, I think that's wonderful because God speaks to everybody all the time. And then how did they run it through their hose? It's not an elegant way of talking about it, but it makes reading the visions of other people really quite nice. When I go to a bakery, I like the variety, right? I have I really, the chocolate chip cookies are fantastic, but I'm aware that this variety all comes from the same source.
You have some beautiful analogies with water. The cup holding the glass of water, like the glass holding the water, the hose, the water being changed, the flavor of the water being changed by the hose is both beautiful analogies.
You get credit for that because one of the things I've observed about this is it has a big vocabulary. When you evoke something, I don't necessarily, some things I have kind of standard answers, like, what did Jack Hilgard say when I was about my dissertation? But other things just come up as we talk, and that's the way living systems probably are. There's always a certain amount of variability if it's a living system.
Yeah.
So I like that water one too.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to maybe describe some of the elements that emerges as you are working with a co-author like Jordan Gruber. You get to work together, and together the emergent thing
Oh, absolutely.
is additionally beautiful between the two of you working. So
Yeah,
another
Jordan and I
encouragement for
really
others to
work
collaborate.
by, I write something or he writes something, I edit it, he edited it, we edit it. So after a while, what happens when you edit things, if you're going in the right direction, is you make smaller and smaller edits.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, you're replacing words, and it could be one or the other, and you're done.
Mm-hmm.
So Jordan, neither of these books could have possibly existed without the synergy that Jordan and I together write.
Absolutely. It's awesome. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. I can't wait to have him as a guest on the podcast as well. There was one story that I would love for you to share that came from the microdosing. It seems to be good for everything, the way that sleep and exercise and good diet can be. But you had mentioned that there was a couple in San Francisco that was homeless and seeking microdosing to fix their
Yeah, no. I know it was. It was the question that gets asked. Well, tell us something bad about it.
Mm-hmm.
Some danger, something. Because one, it's an easy question to ask. You don't have to know anything to say.
Yeah.
Well, what's wrong with it?
Yeah.
And two is It's very realistic because the likelihood of people misusing or being unable to use, so forth. And this was a couple, and they said, we're microdosing, and it's not really very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, how's your life? And it was hard. They weren't homeless. I guess they were technically. They'd lost their apartment of many years, and they were struggling to get a new apartment, and their cat was sick.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I don't think this is a good time for you to microdose. And they said, in essence, thank you very much. We're going to do whatever we goddamn well please. And I said, you know, fine. And about 2 weeks later, I got a little note that said, you were right. We shouldn't have done it. We were not in a good enough space to make use of it. It simply made everything feel worse.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan likes to talk about at least LSD as a, quote, non-specific amplifier. I don't know quite what that means, but it's kind of, you're going to get some of what you came in with. And it's the reason that people say you should have intention, you should do affirmations, you should, breathe and take care of yourself, so that as you get into your advanced ability to use yourself and your body, it's in the right direction. So our general rule of thumb is, if your life is external life is terrible, probably that's not a good time. If your internal life is terrible, that's one of the reasons you want to do it. And there's a small section in the book about schizophrenics and another about bipolar. These are groups, by the way, that there's no information about psychedelics, because no study would want to risk itself in trying them. Since human beings are out there, real life evidence, you get more evidence. There's just more data when you step out of the lab. It's not as clean and easy to scrub, but it's, so for instance, very realistic question, should you microdose while you're pregnant? Okay. Well, let's see what the research says. Let's look at just high doses. Do we have any people who've been pregnant while they were using psychedelics? Well, we had 40 million people in the United States using LSD, just LSD, since it became illegal. Some of them probably got pregnant. I thought, well, we'll just see what all the research is. There's none.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were looking at that, Jordan and I, and then we got in touch with some people and things happened. I helped people design a little questionnaire, because it turns out that women who were pregnant were microdosing. And there was no research, and we had nothing we could tell them, but they could tell us. And so in the book, there's a section for the first time of women who've been microdosing during pregnancy, microdosing around birth, microdosing postpartum, and whether that was a good or bad idea. That's what you can't get in a research paradigm, because nobody's going to approve you're giving psychedelics to pregnant women. But that doesn't prevent pregnant women from wanting to have answers and discovering it for themselves. It's simply, I'm finding real life simply has more opportunities than science, and that science very often simply, see, the problem with science is once it's got itself set, it can't stop. And I'll give you just one example. There's a dose range for microdosing. Above that, it doesn't work. You start to get high. And the dose range for LSD is between, say, 7 and 12 micrograms. And some really good people did a great study on ADHD. I think it was ADHD, and and microdosing, except it wasn't microdosing. They used 20 micrograms. Now that's almost twice what the range is. No surprise, it didn't work. Okay, but to say it took them like 2 years to say we did it wrong from the onset. All we can tell you is it doesn't work when you use too high a dose. That's not really a very exciting piece of research. So they kind of jiggled and jaggled, kind of what they keep using the term low dose and a high version of micro. So it's a little confusing. And all the science writers decided what they said is that microdosing doesn't work for ADHD. We have like 12 pages in the book of all the ways it works. So the science couldn't have been, I know some of these people, it's a really clean study with one wrong assumption, but no way to correct it. So looking at hard science turns out to have many of the same problems that looking at every other kind of science and your neighbor over the back fence, so forth, that information has to be considered in its context. And that's just as true in elegant science as in kind of the sloppy drunk on the corner that says, I just want to tell you one really important thing, buddy.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate this conversation. You're just, when Jordan Gruber says non-specific amplifier, I don't know if you're a non-specific or a specific amplifier, but you are an amplifier, and it makes my heart sing to be able to have this conversation with you. This is a real full circle moment for me in the field of transpersonal psychology. I hope that I am continuing to do great work in the field to expand the awareness of the field and your legacy as well. What you have done in the psychedelic space and self-help and all the areas that you've been influential, impactful. Just thank you so much for all that you have done and continue to do. And thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Well, I should tell you that the idea of coming into your program and kind of thinking in terms of transpersonal psychology was a little bit of a stretch since I've been out doing other things. And so it was a wonderful pleasure to be asked questions and to come up with some events out of my life that I really don't think I've written down anywhere. So you've just given me some of my legacy, and it was really fun.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're
Thank you so
very,
much.
very good at it because, I mean, the great secret of therapy, of course, is shut up and listen. And people, and that was also the secret of consulting. The secret is the same as therapy. See, if you do therapy long enough, the client will tell you what the problem is and what the solution is. And consulting is the same, where you just wait till they tell you, and they can't hear themselves, and then you tell them, and they say, how long have you been involved in this industry? And the answer is like 5 hours. So you have evoked beautifully, and your interest was genuine. There's no feigning. There's no kind of putting it on. That really interests you. So you evoked from me things that I certainly wouldn't have come up with on my own. So it is a use of both of us very well. And I love that.
Yeah, I love it too. Thank you so much, Jim. I appreciate it.
Thank you. You're thinking, who is this man talking